Welcome to the Detachment Lab. I am Wolfie. Before heartbreak can be understood clearly, it has to be separated from the simplified way people usually describe it. Most people reduce heartbreak to the loss of a person. That is part of it, but it is rarely the whole event. Heartbreak tends to reach further than relationship itself. It interferes with projection, continuity, and the emotional architecture the mind had already started building around what came next. That is why heartbreak often feels disproportionate to the visible ending. The intensity is not only attached to what was lost, it is attached to where the bond appeared to be leading, what it seemed to promise, and how much of the future had quietly begun organizing itself around that promise. A relationship does not remain contained to the present for very long. Once attachment deepens, the mind begins generating continuity. It starts forecasting ordinary life. It folds the other person into future decisions, future rituals, future logistics, future identity. This process is not always dramatic. Much of it happens quietly. The nervous system starts orienting around the expectation that the connection will continue, and that expectation becomes part of how safety, direction, and meaning are processed. So when heartbreak occurs, that continuity fractures. The person may still be the most visible loss, but the deeper disruption often lies in the collapse of the future the bond had already begun to symbolize. The mind is not merely adjusting to absence. It is also confronting the disappearance of a life path it had already started treating as emotionally real. That is the first thing that needs to be recognized. Heartbreak is not just separation, it is the destabilization of the internal structure. One reason heartbreak is so difficult to metabolize is that the facts of the relationship and the emotional projection attached to it do not dissolve at the same time. A relationship can end in reality while the future it represented remains active in the mind. That gap creates confusion. The person may be gone, emotionally unavailable, disloyal, or just no longer capable of sustaining the bond. Yet, the internal world that formed around them often continues operating for a while, as though continuity is still possible. This is where rumination tends to enter. People often assume they are missing someone, when in many cases, they are trying to recover coherence. They revisit conversations, moments, plans, and turning points, not only because they are grieving, but the mind is attempting to restore a version of a timeline that no longer exists. That effort can look like longing, bargaining, fixation, obsessive memory review, or emotional revisionism. The relationship starts to be revisited through a selective lens. Potential gets weighted more heavily than pattern. Beautiful moments begin carrying more interpretive force than structural instability. The version of the person that fit the future is elevated, while the version that made the future impossible is softened, delayed, or partially edited out. None of this makes a person foolish. It is reflecting the difficulty of releasing a projection once the body has attached to it as though it was a fact. Heartbreak becomes especially disorienting when the relationship did not end cleanly. If betrayal, emotional withdrawal, replacement, deception, or unresolved ambivalence were involved, the collapse does not simply feel like loss. It also feels like contradiction. The ending is no longer only painful, it becomes difficult to organize mentally. A person is left trying to grieve what was meaningful while also accounting for what was false, unstable, or incomplete from the beginning. That complexity is part of why heartbreak can feel heavier than people expect it to. A more accurate understanding of heartbreak begins when it is recognized as a double loss. There is the loss of the person. There is also the loss of the projected future built around them. The first loss is relational. It concerns attachment, intimacy, ritual, companionship, erotic life, emotional familiarity, the experience of being known, and the particular role that person occupied in the daily existence. The second loss is structural. It concerns direction, imagined stability, anticipated milestones, and the version of the self that had already started forming inside that bond. The second loss is often less visible, but it is frequently what gives heartbreak its particular force. This is why heartbreak does not always sound like, "I miss them." Often underneath that statement is more complicated. It's grief. I miss the life I thought this was becoming. I miss the certainty I borrowed from that future. I miss the self that felt more anchored while the future still seemed available. Once this layer is understood, the magnitude of heartbreak becomes easier to read. The person is not only grieving attachment, they are grieving orientation. In some cases, the individual represented more than love. They may have represented safety after instability, emotional homecoming after loneliness, symbolic arrival after years of disappointment, or relief from a future that previously felt uncertain. When that kind of bond collapses, the grief extends beyond the person and begins interacting with identity, direction, and self-concept. This is one reason heartbreak can feel like a total internal disruption, even when the relationship itself had obvious weaknesses. What is being lost is not only what the relationship objectively was. What is being lost is the meaning the mind attached to it. The central difficulty in heartbreak is that attachment does not end the moment the relationship does. A person can know the relationship is no longer stable, no longer honest, and they will still feel emotionally drawn towards it. That does not mean they lack discernment. It means the nervous system is slower than the mind to release. This is where heartbreak becomes vulnerable to repetition. When the collapse feels intolerable, the mind starts searching for partial restoration. It becomes more susceptible to nostalgia, ambiguity, intermittent contact, idolized memory, and fantasies of repair. A relationship does not need to be healthy to remain psychologically magnetic. It only needs to have carried enough projection to make its loss feel like a collapse in meaning. Earlier material can intensify this. When betrayal, abandonment, inconsistency, or emotional deprivation shaped prior attachment, the current heartbreak often activates more than the present ending. It touches older fault lines around being chosen, being left, being replaced, or being asked to endure instability in order to preserve connection. At that point, heartbreak is no longer only about what ended recently. It becomes the place where present loss meets older architecture. That is why detachment matters as correction. Heartbreak becomes even more difficult when the person is grieved but the projection is left unnamed. That usually creates two problems. The grief stays vague, and longing starts carrying more authority than it should. To grieve clearly, the future has to be included. The plans, assumptions, rehearsals, imagined continuity, and the emotional reliance on later all belong in the mourning process. Not because they were guaranteed, because they were inhabited. That distinction is relevant. The future may have been projection, but the attachment to it was real. A person can grieve something that was never formally promised if their body had already started organizing around it. This is where people often become harsh with themselves. They think they are overreacting to something that never fully materialized. More often, they are grieving accurately but without language. The heart grieves investment. The nervous system grieves continuity. The psyche grieves meaning. Accuracy still matters. When grief loses contact with truth, it turns sentimental and starts arguing for a return. Longing becomes evidence. Nostalgia starts overriding structure. Pain gets treated as proof that the relationship be restored, rather than proof that an important internal attachment has been ruptured. That is why grief here requires more than feeling it. It requires clarity. The person is not only mourning what was beautiful, they are also mourning what never became stable enough, the life they never got to build. In heartbreak, detachment often has to begin with the timeline. Many people think they are trying to let go of a person when what they are actually struggling to release is the future that depended on that person's continued participation. The difference matters. The person may no longer be available, trustworthy, reciprocal, emotionally present. The future, however, can remain active in the mind long after reality has withdrawn its support. The future needs to be named. The imagined home, the imagined stability, the imagined answer to an old loneliness, the imagined life that seemed to justify everything the relationship cost. Once named, the difficulty becomes easier to understand. The mind is not only giving up a bond, it is giving up the meaning system built around that bond. Detachment becomes possible when a person can say, without dramatization or without sentimental editing, that the version of the future is no longer available. That statement is not cold, it's orienting. Without it, people remain in negotiation. They are not always trying to recover the person. Often they are trying to recover the structure, the direction, the continuity, the internal gravity the bond once seemed to provide. But a future cannot be restored through attachment to a present that no longer supports it. That is why detachment is not distance. It is the withdrawal of emotional authority from a collapsed projection. Heartbreak often leaves part of yourself suspended at the sight of rupture. That part keeps reviewing, bargaining, returning, or reaching. It is not irrational. It is often trying to recover orientation. What it needs is not criticism, it needs leadership. Reparenting here means refusing to abandon yourself after collapse. It means responding to longing without obeying it. It means understanding the pull to return without treating it like instruction. It means recognizing that some part of you is still trying to restore continuity and answering that effort with steadiness instead of indulgence or contempt. The internal language begins to change. I understand why this hurts. I understand why I keep looking backward. I understand what I believed this would become. I also understand that returning to what ended will not rebuild what I imagined. This is where self-trust begins to return, not through certainty, through reliability. A person learns that grief, longing, emptiness, and unfinishedness do not have to be a result that leads to self-abandonment. That is a major shift in heartbreak recovery. It marks the point where the self stops revolving entirely around the lost bond and becomes capable of holding the loss without disappearing inside it. Once the projection loosens, there is often emptiness. That emptiness can feel frightening because the structure that had been providing internal direction is gone. Many interpret that space as proof that too much has been lost. Often, it is simply the first honest space that have occupied since the collapse began. This is where rebuilding becomes possible, not by recovering the exact future that broke, by allowing a different future to become conceivable without demanding that it resemble the one that was lost. That takes patience. Grief often speaks in absolutes. It tells the mind that if one future collapsed, the other future itself is no longer trustworthy. That is grief, not reality. Repatterning means teaching the system that openness is still possible after collapse, that a future can exist without being immediately assigned to the next available chemistry, that continuity can be rebuilt from reality rather than projection, that life can reorganize around truth rather than longing. A person begins returning to their own rhythms, their own preferences, and their own capacity to imagine a life not derived from the relationship that ended. That return may be quiet, but it is significant. It marks the difference between grieving a loss and building an identity around it. Over time, the nervous system starts learning something it could not accept while still attached to projection. The lost future was not the only possible future. It was simply the one most emotionally rehearsed. Heartbreak is often described as the loss of a relationship. That is true, but incomplete. More accurately, heartbreak is often the collapse of a continuity. A person loses not only attachment, but direction. Not only intimacy, but the future the intimacy appeared to be creating. Not only the other person, but the self that had already started forming inside that anticipated bond. That is why heartbreak can feel as though it reaches into everything. It is not merely emotional pain. It is a disruption in the internal structure of your life. Detachment keeps that disruption from hardening into a permanent loop. It helps separate the person from the projection, the present from the anticipated future, and the actual pattern from the emotional meaning attached to it. It keeps grief honest. It prevents longing from taking the lead and makes it possible to stop building around what is no longer available. The loss of one future is not the end of a life. It is the end of one projection. Heartbreak did not only remove a person, it removed a future your mind had already started inhabiting. That is why it lingers. That is why it disorients. That is why it can feel larger than the visible facts of the relationship. But a collapsed projection is not a final verdict on your ability to build. It is a rupture in direction, not the destruction of possibility. So the work is not to recover the exact future that broke. The work is to become honest enough to stop organizing your life around what is no longer present. Do not treat longing as evidence. Do not mistake the intensity of attachment for the stability of the bond. Do not keep negotiating with a timeline that required two people to sustain it. The shift begins when reality is allowed to outrank projection. That is what detachment does here. It does not erase love. It removes self-abandonment from the grieving process. Thank you for being here. I'm Woofy. This has been the Detachment Lab. Keep your heart and let the rest go.